Something. Okay, so I'd like to formally, welcome Emily Wilkinson, who is our speaker for the first keynote series called Islands at Risk. And it's really a great pleasure, Emily, for you to come and offer this presentation to us, to this community. And I hope many more people will have the opportunity to listen to this talk also in the future as we are documenting this talk. So as an introduction, briefly, I mean, most of you have received her bio and also her link, but she's a senior research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, the ODI, in the Global Risk and Resilience Program, and is also a director of the Resilient and Sustainable Islands Initiative, that is RAISI in short, and is also advising the Alliance for Small Island States, the AOSIS, and has been working for like over 25 years as an analyst, as a researcher, journalist, teacher, and advising island governments across the world by providing analysis and leading the debate on climate and disaster risks and resilience and aspects of governance and financing. So what a pleasure, Emily. Thank you again. And I'll hand it over to you. Please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you so much, Simron, for the kind introduction, and hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully it will work. I've been having some difficulties with my computer today. So please let me know if you can't see my screen or if it's not looking as it should.
I can see your screen. Everything looks great.
Fantastic, great. So the title of the talk today is "What's History Got to Do with It? Colonialism, Structural Vulnerabilities and Risk Accumulation in Small Island Developing States." I wanted to, in this talk, reflect a bit on some of the historical, structural reasons why small island developing states are as vulnerable as they are to climate shocks, but other kinds of external shocks as well, and to dig a bit really into some of the decisions that were taken during particularly kind of colonial periods that have a bearing on the levels of risk that small island developing states face today. I'm going to focus specifically on the case of Dominica, where I did some research and have been working for a long time, including as an advisor to the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica, and then broaden out again to the challenges that all small island developing states face, and particularly in relation to financing their resilience ambitions, and talk about some of the sort of climate justice issues that are becoming more and more sort of pertinent and discussed in the particularly in the international climate negotiations. So I wanted to start really with just a kind of overview of what SIDS structural vulnerabilities are. There we go. You'll probably all be very familiar with a lot of these, so I'll run through fairly quickly. But these are sort of the common challenges which make SIDS sort of more similar to each other than they are different. So obviously small populations, and smallness is the sort of most notable feature really. And small islands, small populations have a bearing on the size of the bureaucracy and the size of government, and the ability for governments to undertake a number of tasks, and often means, of course, that people working in government and national agencies wear more than one hat. They have to do a lot of tasks in order to fulfill all the kind of duties of government. There's small economies as well, of course, and lack diversification. It's very difficult to diversify a small economy, which means that they tend to be specialized in one or more sectors, and that can mean that they're sort of highly vulnerable to external shocks if all your eggs are in one basket, if you're kind of highly specialized on a particular sector, particularly when that's agriculture and specific crops, which I'll come back to. or tourism. That means that the economies are highly vulnerable. Linked to that is the very small domestic markets and the high cost of doing business, and for some, particularly the Pacific small island developing states, challenges in connectivity and remoteness, linking up to local regional markets, and the costs of importing and exporting. All of these things make these islands sort of less attractive for investment, for foreign direct investment, which in the case of other developing countries can be kind of really a huge driver for economic growth and development. Fragile environments is a really kind of critical characteristic. There's a kind of flip side of that, they're very kind of biodiverse, but certainly the fragility of the ecosystems and some of the kind of development activities in coastal areas in particular that have really sort of undermined and threatened those ecosystems is a big problem. And then the dependence on economic openness and neoliberal sort of trade liberalization. The SIDS have done well in the kind of era of globalization and liberal kind of economic orders. As that begins to kind of close down and the opportunities for exploiting economic niches becomes more challenging, as there are kind of regional blocks and shifting geopolitics, that will make it harder for SIDS to sort of do well and find these niches in the kind of global economic system. Then, of course, they also share some really important attributes for sort of global stability and multilateralism, and also for biodiversity. So they have some attributes of SIDS which are important global public goods. They make up 20% of UN countries, I think, approximately, so quite an important sort of block in international diplomacy. They had big influence on international negotiations, particularly the Alliance of Small Island States in terms of shaping the Paris Agreement and subsequent negotiations, and around issues around oceans and ocean protection. They are custodians of the largest exclusive economic zones in the world, some of the largest, and those are the ocean space, which belongs to small island developing states, very many times larger than the terrestrial areas of these countries, which also means they're custodians of that biodiversity and the ocean that come under their territories, which are important carbon sinks. The huge biodiversity, which I mentioned before, is a particular attribute of SIDS, and of course the overall, the really important narrative that they contribute very little to greenhouse gas emissions, but of course are will be the first and probably the heaviest hit by climate change in many ways. So that's just the kind of background. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with a lot of those aspects, but just to kind of show all of the characteristics that they have in common and why it's such a special group of countries. What they also have in common, and which comes up maybe less in the literature, is that because of their location and geography and topography, they are very hazardous places. And I think this graph is really interesting because it shows that the majority of small island developing states are located in the tropics. So they're going to be, particularly exposed to tropical cyclones and storm surge and flooding in relation to tropical cyclones, extreme weather. They're also, many of them, located close to tectonic plates, so they're exposed to earthquakes, and many of them are volcanic islands. So, that's kind of the range of different hazards which affect SIDS disproportionately, really, because of their location and topography. And that's most of them, apart from some archipelagos. So that's another kind of really critical structural factor when it comes to thinking about what SIDS as a group, what their vulnerabilities are, and what the constraints might be on development. In the latest IPCC report, there's some really strong findings around small island developing states, including the irreversible losses on terrestrial, freshwater, coastal and open marine systems that are expected, really high confidence around that. Their increasing exposure to weather and climate extremes and acute food insecurity, and the likelihood of climate change driving displacement disproportionately in island states. So those are all kind of strong findings, high confidence findings in the latest IPCC report in relation to small islands. And notably, the IPCC report also points to the historical and ongoing patterns of inequality, such as colonialism, as being a driver of vulnerability, particularly for Indigenous people and local communities. Which I think is particularly important, and a sort of segue into what I'm going to talk about now, which is a particular case of disasters and risk in Dominica. So we did some research going back through the historical archives to look at where people are located in Dominica, and going back to 1493, when Columbus first set sights on Dominica. We don't actually know if he landed there. And there are estimates, there have been estimates since through census data and observations, mainly in the historical archives. In the UK, the colonial governments kept quite good records of roughly where people were living. And we sort of mapped that, put that onto a map of where the kind of hazardous locations, where hazardous parts of Dominica are, and coded those, color-coded those in relation to the sort of level of hazard risk, and it's combined different hazards. I think it was floods and landslides and volcanic and flood, landslide, volcanic risk. And you can see that over time, so when back in 1493, the Kalinaga people were mainly located in the northeast of the island, and fairly sort of inland, like not right on the coast, fairly sheltered from from hurricanes. And over time, with kind of development of particular Rosa as the capital, you can see the increasing numbers of people that are now living in the very high hazardous areas. And then, there's explanations for that over time, which I think are really interesting and probably have kind of strong parallels with other small island developing states, particularly in the Caribbean, which start with transatlantic slavery, really, and people being brought to the region to work on the sugar plantations initially, and at the end of slavery, the abolishment of slavery, being moving off that land, but not having options for where they could live. So a lot, most of the sort of movement off the plantations, which were in all of the kind of the flatter land, the safer land within Dominica, people were forced to move into sort of dangerous ravines and into the coastal areas on the Crown lands, or the sort of settlements kind of illegally on the coast, in places that are exposed to storm surge and flooding, but also because they were sort of illegal settlements. The result was that they weren't kind of building housing sort of for the long term. They were very much sort of improvising and building kind of less sort of robust housing in those locations. So there's a gradual pattern of people moving towards the southwest and into the Rosa Valley, which is very high risk of flooding and landslides, but also that pattern of kind of moving off the plantations into some of the more kind of vulnerable parts of the country. And they're just some pictures of taken in around the 1890s of some of the plantations. And again, the point really that the land use and where people ended up locating was very much in relation to the decisions around agriculture. And I'll just show you a couple of other graphs, which maybe you can't see very clearly what's happening here, but it's really to demonstrate how the sort of logic of agricultural investment in Dominica and the sort of failed attempts to develop particular crops, so starting with sugar and coffee, moving into lime and bananas, and all of these kind of agricultural crops and the sort of monoculture was attempted one after the other. So first an attempt with sugar, often the whole kind of crop being wiped out by these different shocks, whether hurricanes or earthquakes, crop disease, and that was happening with each of the crops that were being developed, and quite similar things across other Caribbean countries as well. So it's a sort of boom and bust of sugar, coffee, lime, and banana production in Dominica, showing and really how that sort of investment in one particular type of agriculture wasn't really working, but there was a kind of lack of sort of learning from one event to the other and diversification until much later on. In this map, you can see the development of the road infrastructure in Dominica. At the sort of beginning of the colonial period, it was very much assumed that the plantation owners would be using surplus profit to invest in local infrastructure and build roads, not just connecting the plantations to the coast and the port, but actually connecting around the island. And that didn't really materialize. You can see a very kind of late development to the road infrastructure, with a lot of the sort of roads connecting up the coastal towns not really being built until after until the kind of late 1960s and onwards. So very kind of minimal basic infrastructure until very late on in the 20th century, which also caused kind of additional vulnerabilities in terms of people being connected or being able to evacuate and move when there was a storm or a flood event. Also wanted to say something about the response to disasters and the kind of mentality during the colonial period. The disasters were very much sort of seen as a problem for the governor and the island administrators, because of obviously the loss of production and income caused, and the response was very much providing kind of ad hoc grants and loans to the plantation owners. Not to any of the kind of affected populations, not to anyone, not to any of the workers, slaves or then workers working on the plantations, but just the owners. And this was very much kind of based on the idea and the sort of primary function of the British Empire, which was to maximise profits and while minimising the debt burden. So they were, providing sort of short-term loans and where possible grants, expecting those to be sort of quickly paid off, but often repayment took a lot longer than expected, and there were often like loans kind of rolling from one event to another, and the support was really to kind of compensate landowners for loss of earnings during that period, but there was very little in the way of sort of support or thinking around building back better or avoiding those kind of losses in the future. So there was sort of a repeated pattern of events and sort of failure to learn from those events, either in terms of diversifying crop production or relocating some activities, or thinking about how to better protect crops or agricultural infrastructure. Those are some of the sort of the patterns, repeated patterns that were occurring during the colonial period that have bearing on the vulnerability exposure of infrastructure and assets to hurricanes and other shocks to this day. Coming up to the sort of more sort of present day, the sort of resilience language and agenda in Dominica really begins to appear after the tropical storm Erica in 2015. And then off the back of that, very soon afterwards, when Dominica is still really recovering from Erica, Hurricane Maria in 2017, which wiped out about 226% of GDP, which is really huge, significant, even for a small island developing state. And the observation that these events are becoming more frequent and more intense, but not just hurricanes or tropical cyclones, but also droughts, fires, coastal erosion and coral bleaching. So there's really kind of accumulation of both the events themselves and the impacts and the failure to recover, but also the kind of acknowledgement of that from the science and from the international community kind of focusing increasingly on these events. But the devastation caused by Maria was really so significant that it really led to a kind of an important shift in thinking within government, and the government of Dominica, or the Prime Minister, expressing this idea of Dominica becoming the world's first nation. And I think that's, as I say, a very bold statement, and probably not something that can be kind of necessarily achieved or demonstrated, but very much a kind of posited as a call to action to the international community to help support this resilience ambition. And this is the sort of the foundations of the thinking around what that resilience ambition looks like, that Dominica wants to have a stronger overall socioeconomic development trajectory, so a more robust economy, more robust society, so that they're better able to absorb these kind of shocks, less affected by these kind of shocks. Also, the ability to actually, reduce the impact. So that's more kind of the disaster risk reduction, making buildings and assets and livelihoods more kind of robust, or reducing the vulnerability and exposure of those assets. And then, really importantly as well, reducing the time to recover, so really speeding up recovery after these events, knowing that they will continue to happen, but they can't be entirely avoided. With all the good political will and investment in the world, there's always going to be a need to recover. So that's the kind of intellectual thinking that goes into the climate resilience and recovery plan. And then what that plan actually looks like in practice is quite interesting, because it was very much a sort of, it's very much a homegrown plan, in the sense that it's not written by a group of consultants from the World Bank or any other kind of external consultancy group. This is generated by the government of Dominica and by the Climate Resilience Execution Agency, which was set up after Maria. And these are some of the very bold targets which have been set for 2030, including 0 fatalities from extreme weather. I think the second one is really interesting in terms of what it then kind of prompts, because communities being able to operate safely and independently for 15 days will require for them to have each community to have access to water and food and energy, and shelter, and various other will need to have all the kind of equipment and backup in place. So the support needed so that every community is able to operate safely and independently for 15 days is focused on that kind of community resilience. And I think it has definitely stimulated greater investment in that kind of community autonomy when there are different kinds of shocks. There's a lot of rebuilding and retrofitting going on to make housing and infrastructure more resilient. Of course, that doesn't happen overnight. Takes a very, very long time, and is extremely costly. I don't think anyone really kind of estimated how much it would cost to rebuild Dominica and to build back better, to make the infrastructure more resilient. So yeah, and then there are targets as well around protecting and leveraging the natural resources that Dominica has, and including its ability to become 100% reliant on renewable energy through the production of geothermal energy, which is currently underway. I want to say just a couple of things about sort of finance. It's a topic that I work on quite a lot. Hopefully this is not the boring bit. because I think it's really important to the overall picture and the ability of Dominica or any other island to really be able to implement this level of ambition, because clearly I think there's really no small island developing state in the world that is going to be able to do this from public resources. Dominica certainly can't. The estimates were to become resilient, anything between 3.3 and 3.6 billion US dollars. The government has, spending some of its resources going into that, building critical infrastructure and other projects. But there is a significant financing gap, and with the high levels of external debt that Dominica faces, I think that has gone up since these are pre-COVID figures. It's going to be extremely difficult for the government of Dominica or any government of a small island to be able to finance this kind of expenditure. So external finance is really very important, and there's a lot of discussion ongoing about reforming the international financing architecture, and a big meeting this week in Paris that will address some of these issues, not explicitly for small islands, but the overall kind of international financing architecture more generally. We did a little study last month, 2 months ago. I'm looking at financing available for small island developing states for resilience. And there are a couple of issues to note. This doesn't apply to Dominica specifically, but there are small island developing states that, because they have fairly high levels of income, are not eligible for official development assistance, and therefore very difficult for them to get access to concessional finance, which means the costs of borrowing are extremely high. Even for all countries that do apply or want to get access to climate finance, it's incredibly difficult, bureaucratic and costly process. It can take up to 3 years to get direct access to get eligibility. And the point I made about them having very high levels of debt and lack of fiscal space means that all of this investment has been kind of severely restricted, particularly with COVID and the impact on tourism revenues for many countries. And overall, and I think this is a bigger kind of issue for the development agencies, is the lack of human resources and institutional capacity in SIDS to both to access the finance and to absorb and implement some of these very large projects. These are absolute limitations. It's not going to change. There's not going to suddenly be an increase in people to be able to who can work on project proposals or to implement these projects. So any assistance needs to take these factors into consideration. And that graph just shows you the levels of finance that are going to small island developing states for resilience, extremely low levels compared with other groups of developing countries, and those are all excluding SIDS. Even as a percentage of GDP, the level of finance going to SIDS is very low. Of course, if you look at it in terms of per capita levels of finance, it's high, but then divide any number by a very small number, a small denominator, and you're going to get a high number. And I think that really, that figure, I've put it in there just for sort of transparency, but it's really deceptive in terms of the kind of support that SIDS need to finance their ambitions to become more climate resilient, to adapt to the impacts of climate change and other kinds of external shocks. I think this is probably my last slide. I just wanted to say something about loss and damage, because I don't know, for those maybe not following the climate change negotiations, this was a big turning point at the end of last year at COP27, with the decision to establish a loss and damage fund. Apart from the setting up of the fund itself, which is important, so that there is increased support to countries to deal with the impacts that they have not been able to adapt to, and will continue to grow as mitigation targets and net zero targets fail to be achieved. This is important because it really represents a different way of thinking about international finance that acknowledges, if not in the Paris Agreement itself, but in the sort of the discourse around loss and damage, acknowledges that the idea that there is a historical responsibility for the impacts of climate change, and so some support from developed countries to developing countries, particularly those that are considered vulnerable, is a matter of climate justice. It's based on the principles of the Paris Agreement and the particular kind of polluter pays, that there is a responsibility to be supporting developing countries, in particular SIDS and LDCs, for these impacts. So it's not a question of humanitarian assistance or charity, or even trying to achieve development goals to try and help these countries to become developed in inverted commas, but a recognition that there will always be, there'll be increasingly impacts which countries will need support with to cope with. And I think the quote from the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, in reference to the oil majors is particularly pertinent. How do companies make 200 billion in profits in the last 3 months and not expect to contribute 10 cents on every pound of profit to a loss and damage fund? And I think those are the kinds of sentiments that are become, and views that are becoming stronger and more prominent in discussions around international development and climate finance. And so just to kind of to finish, I think this is perhaps where the sort of historical legacy of colonialism and the kind of the profits of industrialization and the historical responsibilities for the impacts of climate change kind of come together. And it's really in these examples of small island developing states, particularly in the Caribbean, because of transatlantic slavery, where we can see almost this kind of double responsibility to be supporting these small islands, both the responsibility for the impacts of colonialism and the decisions around land use and inappropriate kind of agricultural choices and practices, and lack of investment in infrastructure that have created the high levels of exposure to hazard today, and the sort of extraction of resources, industrialization, and production of greenhouse gases that have contributed to global warming. We see those two kind of coming together in the Caribbean in the ways in which these countries are suffering the effects of climate change, and the sort of structural vulnerabilities and lack of capacity to deal with those impacts. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there and open the floor to questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. This was really thought provoker. Yeah, I mean, I do have questions, but I'm sure others have as well. So I'll open the floor for a Q&A. Can raise your hands using the icon, or just if your video is on. I see Mark, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Emily. Really enjoyed the presentation, and your last comments are really the super pertinent ones, I guess, about that structural vulnerability built on a legacy of colonial and then market-based exploitation, and now receiving the harms of climate change. So I was going to ask you a question about that, the kind of the political economy, and you've been spending a lot of time in Dominica and other places in the Caribbean. I wondered what you thought the kind of realistic perception was of decision makers. Do they feel, in a couple of ways, I mean, how hopeful are they of any kind of structural change? Loss and damages is probably not going to do it before they reach some kind of point of economic collapse. You present Dominica having a 101% GDP equivalent of debt. I'm not an economist, but that sounds like an economy that must be quite close to some sort of, tipping point and crash. So one question is just about what the what the feeling is of decision makers. Do they feel they've got any wriggle room? Are they reliant on a diaspora, on CAT funds to have some smart way out of the next disaster, or not? And then maybe linked to that is perhaps is there actually quite a mature sense of what climate change is in the Caribbean that others can learn? Again, the way you present it, climate change is going to be felt as an economic shock rather than a natural hazards issue. It's more of an economic one, which is, I think that's like a much more mature way of thinking about the way climate change will be received than we often present. So yes, just if you've got any insights on the way in which climate change is being framed, how in those two ways. Thanks a lot.
Shall I go ahead and respond, or?
Yes, please. Yeah, please go ahead, Emily. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think there's probably different levels at which kind of multiple narratives at the same time. So certainly in the kind of climate negotiations, and I've just come back from Bonn, and where I support the Alliance of Small Island States, and I think there's a desire to keep up the pressure and the kind of emphasis on raising this finance and making sure that the financial goals are achieved and that the ambition kind of ramps up. And I think so it's they don't want to kind of let up on that pressure, and it's really important. And they're I think attacking that or dealing with it on various fronts. So it's in the climate negotiations. There's an event this week at the Paris summit on around the sort of MDB reform and the Bridgetown initiative and what that means for SIDS as a in particular the group of SIDS which are middle income countries, which a lot of this kind of reform is focused on. So I think there are so it's like development finance, climate finance, issues around eligibility and using a multi-dimensional vulnerability index, which the UN is working on developing. So I think that's the kind of level of discourse that sort of heads of state and diplomats. I think probably internally, and if you look at their sort of more the kind of details of their plans, you start seeing other options. And this is not so much in the Caribbean, I would say a lot more in the Pacific. So if you look at the kind of adaptation, the NAPs that are beginning to be developed in some of the Pacific islands, and particularly the atolls, you can see different options in there for relocation. And they won't necessarily be talking about that very loudly at the climate change conference, but there is a plan B and a plan C. I think the Marshall Islands has a plan A, plan B, and plan C. Plan C is full relocation to the US, and I don't think anybody wants to see that enacted. So yeah, I think there's probably kind of different sort of parallel discussions. And then I mean, in terms of how they're really going to finance it, I think they're looking for the sort of bigger financing options. So climate finance is really just like a very small amount of money. What they really want is access to long-term, highly concessional loans. I don't think anybody thinks this can be funded through grant finance, even though the pressure, they'll keep up the pressure for that, and loss and damage fund should definitely be grant-based and so on. But I think all this kind of big infrastructure projects that are needed will have to come through loans. And I think there's probably increasing interest in some of the innovative financing solutions as well, and maybe more potential than people thought in the kind of blue bonds and debt for climate swaps and those kinds of instruments. So that if you can write off part of your debt by implementing some of this resilience strategy, then that's a good way of kind of getting some of that off the books. Problem is that they're still stuck with this kind of structural problem of how do you actually generate enough kind of income, otherwise the levels of debt will go up again. So yeah, I think there's probably a lot of things going on at the same time. In terms of the way of sort of thinking about climate change or framing climate change, I think that probably is happening across all small and developing states. You see more and more people talking about the economic impacts, the amount of the GDP that is lost when there is a disaster. The proportion of kind of GDP losses is so high in SIDS that kind of makes the argument enough on its own, that they are a special category and that they should be treated as a special category, whether that's they need a defined percentage of climate finance, or regardless of their income levels, they need to have more access to concessional development finance. I think that's the strongest argument that they have, really, and what makes them actually different from all other developing countries. So no matter the scale of the floods in Pakistan, it's still only 1.5% of GDP or something like that. It's not 250. So yeah, so I think that they've had to kind of develop that sort of nuanced framing to get the attention, and but also to really push for the level of finance that's going to be required. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Other questions? Anyone else? Yes, Rory, please go ahead.
Thanks. That was really great, Emily. Thank you. I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned that, there was no real discussion in colonial debates or documents after disasters about build back better or about improvement, just kind of dealing with the disaster instead of making changes. I just wanted to ask if there was any discussion in those debates at all about those things, because that seems rather odd to me, just that there was no conversation at all about improvements. And I wondered also, following on from that, if there was any discussion about early warning systems, about early colonial meteorology in the islands. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as we were looking through the records, there did seem to be a few voices, and I can't remember there was one individual who was in Parliament, and you can see that in the kind of the notes that were taken during parliamentary debates. I can't remember where he was MP for, who obviously had a bit more of a kind of background in agriculture and was making the point repeatedly that actually the greater diversification of crops was probably needed in order not to have, completely to lose everything, particularly if there was kind of a disease or something. I think that the voice of this person was continually ignored. And this was happening across the whole of the Caribbean, this drive and this desire to focus on one crop, produce as much surplus as possible, and production, first of all sugar, of course, to feed the colonies elsewhere, and then to kind of extract as much economic surplus as possible from one crop, to grow the empire. And I think this was happening across the Caribbean, and maybe it wasn't quite so evident what a disaster that was in other countries that were flatter and had more land that was appropriate for that kind of agricultural production. But Dominica is incredibly mountainous, so there's really very little land that's suitable, but the same crops were being grown at the same time throughout the Caribbean, regardless of what the terrain was like. So I think that was also possibly an issue of not enough people actually spending any time in the Caribbean to kind of realize that there was differences between islands. So yeah, I think there were individuals who were making this point, but it was not kind of getting through. And in terms of the sort of actual building back better, I think that was just thought it was just left up to the individual plantation owners to take those decisions. They were given small grants or loans, mainly loans, I think, to help sort of recover what they'd lost, and that was was up to them to do what they wanted with that support. and whether they distributed that or used it to help any of their workers was entirely up to them. So there would probably have been mixed responses there. On early warning systems, I'm not an expert on this, but I think there were lots of indigenous practices. The Kalinago people had lots of ways of determining whether a storm was coming, and had different ways of preparing for that, and they were quite mobile as well, so they could kind of move inland or to more sheltered areas when they saw the weather was turning. So I think, yeah, as I said, I'm not really an expert. I wouldn't want to talk about that in any more detail, but it certainly seems to be the case anecdotally when you speak to descendants of the Kalinago who still live in Dominica, that they had that their ancestors had were more adaptable and had a better understanding of what was happening with the weather. And I don't know whether climate change has made that more difficult, more uncertainty and variability. But there's certainly in relation to to where they live, they felt very hard done by in terms of the land that was offered to them. And when there was at the end of the sort of the Carib Wars, they were given a plot of land still on the east coast, but it's on a ravine, and it's it's much more kind of exposed to landslides and flooding in that area than where they were living previously. So yeah, they're sort of I think that the feeling is that there is the choices that were taken about what land was going to be used for are quite difficult to undo now, really, because there's still, like, most of the flatter areas in Dominica are still owned, if they're not sort of owned by like one family and with a plantation, they've been developed for something else, producing rum company or something. But actually a lot of that housing and the way in which roads are built is incredibly vulnerable, particularly to floods.
Thanks a lot.
I see Arlene has a question.
Hi, thank you very much, Emily. That was quite a lot of really good information. I wanted to follow up on an article that was recently published in The Guardian with regard to Caribbean islands and transparency and engagement being needed because of people losing access to vulnerable areas that are being sold off to foreign corporation and political financiers, including protected lands and some of these areas that are really needed to ensure that the vulnerable ecosystems are preserved. In your research, did you have any thoughts on the impact of these citizenship by investment things and areas in which, for example, the article talked about an area in St. Lucia that was connecting the two pitons that ended up being somehow someone else from Canada has now gotten this land, and the public then raised an alarm about losing access to the beach and what the impacts are for the ecology. And I know this is not only a problem in St. Lucia, but there are some other places where this could be a problem. And these are all linked. I mean, climate change and development are very closely linked because in the Caribbean, so much of our infrastructure is on the coast. We're heavily dependent on tourism. We also have certain islands like Dominica that are so mountainous that, in terms of certain things that you can do are very much coastal. And Antigua and Barbuda, for example, they've been the chair of the OECD, the AOSIS, that's the SIDS, right? And they're having a meeting there next year in 2024. But at the same time, there's this push for citizenship by investment to add money to the economy. And these things seem to be working not in tandem, but actually in conflict. Can you say something more about that, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. I think that's a really interesting point, and maybe just sort of linking it to Mark's question as well. I do think there's a sort of double discourse, somewhat contradictory sometimes, between the kind of externally facing kind of approach of SIDS governments to demonstrate the vulnerability and in economic terms, and to kind of to try and increase the level of sort of finance and availability of finance on the one hand, in order for them to implement their ambition, but at the same time actually some kind of internal dilemmas and other interests kind of working in opposition to this. And it's certainly the case that small island developing states, particularly in the Caribbean, because of the high kind of value of tourism and the dependence on tourism for the economic dependence on tourism, will continue to prioritize those interests, which are very much odds. And you give some good examples of how that's working at the moment. So the citizenship by investment programs, by their very nature, are not very transparent. So it's actually quite hard to get a sense of where those investments have been, and the extent to which they do or don't kind of comply with regulations around, for example, environmental protection, but also sort of land use regulations, building codes, and all the rest. And I think it's it's very difficult. I don't think those programs have been really properly evaluated. And it's unlikely that well, it might be the case, but external investors or external new citizens will be as aware or well informed to be able to comply with all of those standards. It's also the case with some of the big infrastructure projects that have been built. I think in Dominica, there have been quite a few that have been built with loans from China, Chinese development, which again, anecdotally, may not comply with all of the standards which some of the other with infrastructure projects being built by other development partners do. So I think there's all kinds of different interests at work here, and Antigua and Barbuda, which has been whose Prime Minister talks very eloquently about the importance of adaptation and resilience to climate change, and the debt of the international community to small island developing states, has also been accused internally of supporting a particular recovery mode or model in Barbuda, which is quite controversial, and has led to kind of privatization of communal land in order to kind of build that economy and increase tourism to Barbuda. So I think it's a very pertinent issue, and I think maybe these kinds of contradictions should be brought up in the preparations for the SIDS-4 conference next year, and in the Antigua and Barbuda agenda, because they are all realities of SIDS development trajectories, and I think it's important that they aren't just swept under the carpet. There's going to be a lot of priorities at that conference, but they shouldn't all just be externally facing what SIDS need from external actors. There should also be a kind of reflection on those development processes and contradictions internally. Some of them are perhaps less controversial as they're made out to be. I think, for example, some of the kind of the way in which SIDS have developed their financial services and been kind of criticised for their role as sort of offshore like tax havens, I think is perhaps is less controversial than some of the kind of developed countries and development partners make that out to be. I mean, they're exploiting a niche, and there is no and it's it's one that developed countries themselves haven't done enough to crack down on. So I think there are sort of more or less real issues in some of the ways in which SIDS have achieved the development they've achieved, and how sort of equitable and sustainable that is.
Okay, thank you. I think that's we are close to the hour, but I would like to ask one question, if I may, as moderator, and maybe a brief response to that. So there's a lot of talk about climate finance and the inadequate aspects, that it's not enough funds, and so. But what are your thoughts about how the money is being spent, like in terms of adaptation projects? The approach that's being taken under the name of adaptation. So how would you evaluate those strategies, if they are maybe in the right direction, or there's some fundamentally wrong in those approaches, or what are your thoughts on the use of that those funds?
Yeah, I think there's probably there's two interesting things about that. It's like a lot of countries have obviously had to respond to recent kind of catastrophic events and extreme weather events by sort of fast tracking some recovery projects and calling them climate resilience, and doing their best to kind of to insert principles of building back better and resilience into things that they need to get on and do. And I think those kinds of plans and the ways of using climate finance are very different to the sort of longer term approach of developing a national adaptation plan, which involves a very lengthy and costly climate risk assessment, probably for different sectors, developing a plan and costing it and working out the priority sectors, and all of that being a kind of participatory process involving different sectors, communities, and so on. So I think those two things are happening at the same time, or that's what I observe in a lot of countries, particularly those that have experienced events recently. And they don't quite match up. So they're having to sort of accelerate things and potentially not necessarily building climate resilience into everything that they're doing, while at the same time developing these very sophisticated long-term plans to deal with an uncertain future, which is also complicated. And the discussions that the AOSIS group were having last week and the week before around the global goal and adaptation were really interesting, because they're saying, well, we're developing these very sophisticated plans, but we don't really know what future it is we're adapting to. And any sort of global goal, which whether that's an aggregate of what individual countries are doing or just some kind of global figure, it could be meaningless if the temperature goal is completely surpassed or much quicker than we expected. So I think there's sort of stuck a bit, I think, and perhaps developing countries more broadly are stuck with trying to accelerate and get on and do the implementation around something where there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and I don't see that being kind of resolved very easily, and they're very, very keen to attract private investment and to develop what they call like bankable projects to actually kind of attract investors, but no one's very clear really on what that looks like and what the potential of that is. So in the meantime, it's just much easier to kind of develop individual projects, apply to the climate funds, and implement those projects. So it ends up looking a bit piecemeal. We're just basically funding different things, particularly if they have to go through a regional or international direct access entity like UNDP. Then the projects that get funded are the ones that UNDP identified as being priority. So it all ends up being a bit kind of ad hoc and piecemeal rather than implementation of an actual strategy, partly because the strategy isn't quite there, and partly because no one's actually 100% sure that's the right strategy. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a messy picture, and amongst that, of course, responding to events as they happen and trying to recover as quickly as possible. It's a very messy process, I would say.
Yeah.
Your question.
No, that's That's very helpful response. Thanks a lot, Emily. And I know we are at the hour, and I don't want to take people's more time because we all have other things to do. So I would simply take the opportunity to give my sincere thanks to Emily for taking the time and sharing this excellent presentation, and also to all of you who took time to attend and engage in this conversation. This is really important, and I think it's a very important discussion, and I hope we can continue the conversation in other kind of platforms. So, okay, so thank you, everyone, and have a great day and evening, night, wherever you are, and be well.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. Bye.